My name is Madison Crane, and my project is on the stolen babies of Franco in Spain. I chose this topic because there's not a lot of information published on it in English, and I was curious to how and why these crimes happened. So to give some background on how Franco came to power, the Spanish Civil War was a conflict that happened between 1936 and 1939. It happened between the left-leaning Spanish government, who was known as the Republicans, versus some far-right groups known as the Nationalists, who were backed by Nazi Germany. It ended in a nationalist victory, with the fascist dictator Francisco Franco being named the head of state. Franco named Roman Catholicism as the national religion, and the Catholic Church had a huge role in the regime and was even given police powers. This was instrumental in how they were able to help commit these crimes. So these kidnappings can be separated into two phases, and the first is rooted in Franco's ideology and eugenics. So Franco, as a nationalist, thought that Republicans were all dirty communists who were ruining Spanish society. So the doctor Antonio Vallejo Noguera was the head psychiatrist for the Franco regime, and he believed that communism was genetic. He conducted many experiments in prisons trying to find knowledge on what he called the red gene. He also developed the idea that if communist babies were separated from their mothers at a young enough age, they could be fixed. So the first victims of these kidnappings were Republican prisoners. So thousands of women who were thought to have aided the Republicans during the war, even been sympathetic to their cause, were imprisoned after its conclusion. In these prisons, the women were brutally beaten, raped, and killed. And many of them, when they entered the prison, were pregnant or had very small children, and they were often allowed to carry out their pregnancy if they could, in the circumstances, and they were allowed to raise the child until the age of 2 or 3. And at that point, the prison guards would take the child and give it to a family that was wealthy, Catholic, and loyal to the Franco regime to be raised as a good Catholic Franco-Spaniard. So over time, the kidnappings had to change, and this brings me to the second phase of the kidnappings. So in the 1950s, the Spanish economy was suffering greatly, and they had to open up their country to international exchange, trade, and visitors. And also at this point, the kidnappings had become a great source of revenue because they realized people were willing to pay a lot of money for a healthy newborn baby. So the motivation behind these crimes had changed from one of ideology to money-making. The location and method of stealing the children also had to change because by this point, many of the prisoners from the war were dead. So what happened was hospital workers, priests, and nuns worked together to convince women that their babies had died after birth. So what would happen, many victims have told their stories, is that they would go in and give birth. They would often be given drugs that they didn't need to make them more delusional, and they would take their baby to conduct routine tests to check and see if they were healthy. A few hours later, the nuns would come back, the nurses would come back and say, "We're so sorry, but your baby had died. Don't worry though, you're young, you're healthy, you can definitely have another one. Well, you can't see the baby, we're gonna bury it, that's that, don't worry about it." And of course a lot of mothers raised questions and tried to see their babies, but they were told that if they tried to see the baby before it was buried, that it would be a sin, the baby wouldn't go to heaven, all kinds of manipulative things. And of course in Catholic Spain, these mothers were very likely to trust these church officials because why would a nun or priest lie to them about their baby dying? So that's what would happen. And they especially targeted women in poverty, young couples, or women that had twins because they believed that if a woman was allowed to take the other twin away, take the other twin home, they wouldn't be as concerned about the baby that had died. So these babies would be sold for thousands of dollars to both Spanish and international families. Many of these babies that were kidnapped live today in Mexico and the United States, not even aware that they were kidnapped. And federal laws enabled these practices. So the Spanish government passed laws, and they said it was to aid in the moral, they said that it was to help the birth mothers of adoption. So what happened was babies, to adopt the baby, the birth mother did not have to sign her permission, and they said that was to protect the identity and to prevent her from being scorned for her sin of having a baby out of wedlock. But in reality, it was so that they could steal the babies without the mom's permission and sell them. So one case that was not happening in hospitals or prisons is the case of the Pina Grande boarding school. And this was a government-run boarding school that for pregnant teenagers, and it ran from 1960 to 1984. and it was staffed entirely by nuns. And what would happen was the federal government gave the Catholic Church the ability to take pregnant or unwed women and take custody of them. So many were taken against their will to this boarding school, and women were abused and malnourished, and they were forced to work throughout their entire pregnancy. And many women that were forced to live there said that they were so malnourished that they didn't gain any weight throughout the course of their entire pregnancy, that their baby barely survived. The women were physically and verbally abused. They were scorned and manipulated during childbirth itself, and they tried to manipulate them into signing away the rights of their children. Another tactic they would use was that they would make the woman perform their chores, and if the woman did not finish her chores on time, she was not allowed to feed her baby, so the baby would be starving. The babies were sold, women that lived there claimed that babies were sold for about the modern day equivalent of $7,000 in the 1970s and about $90,000 in the 1980s. And here is a worker at Piña Grande with a group of the babies. So these crimes were not known to the public, not known to the media because of the big suppression on free speech in media in Francoist Spain. But in 2011, Juan Luis Moreno, who's the man on the right, his father was dying, and on his deathbed he told him that him and his childhood friend Antonio Barroso had been bought from a nun as babies. And they were very concerned. They felt betrayed by their parents for always lying to them, so they went to lawyers, they went to the media, and it brought forward hundreds and thousands of other women and children that said that the same thing had happened to them. Many people had suspected, many of these mothers had suspected that their baby had never actually died, and they always felt something was wrong. So when they saw this, they thought, oh, that's what happened to my child, and many children came forward too. So hundreds of these cases were filed, but few families have made any progress in their investigations because the government has resisted heavily. So the struggle for justice. Many cases that were filed had been dismissed even when families had significant amounts of evidence. What would happen was families would try to go to hospitals where they gave birth and look for birth certificates, death certificates, burial certificates, and the hospitals would say, oh, you never gave birth here, or we don't have record of that because of flood or a fire. That was their standard response. Some people actually made it to the next step, and they got court order exhumations of graves. So what happened was when they digged up the graves, they would find empty caskets, they would find caskets with rocks in them, or they would find caskets with limbs of adult humans in. So this even backs up their claims that something happened. And then federal laws have also prevented courts from being able to prosecute and punish those responsible. So after Franco died and the regime turned into a democracy in 1975, they passed an amnesty law saying that anybody who had committed a crime during the Franco regime could not be punished for it. It was part of the pact of forgetting. They were trying to forget and move on. And in addition, the one doctor who has been prosecuted for these crimes did not receive any punishment because he said that it had been too many years since the crimes had happened. In addition, the government has promised multiple times to set up DNA banks to aid mothers and children in finding each other, and they have not done so. So this January, some progress is being made. Spain's Attorney General office announced that they did have plans to perform the first national investigation. 58 cases were chosen that occurred between 1954 and 1994. So the chief prosecutor on the case has said that the evidence has shown that there is a connection between church officials, hospital staff, and the federal government. But it's not enough evidence to prove yet that there was a nationwide organization facilitating these crimes. However, the victims that I spoke to are hopeful because this is the first investigation that's being funded and conducted by the federal government, and they really think that this is the best chance for justice and for finding their children. Thank you.